Hey guys, it's Pastor Luke here, coming to you with our midweek devotional for Wednesday. And we are still making our way through the story. We're in chapter 25 this week, which is Jesus, the Son of God. And one thing you'll notice that during Jesus' ministry and his time on earth, as he gets closer and closer to Jerusalem and the cross and everything that he has to do there, his purposes become increasingly clear. Like things that maybe seemed a little bit fuzzy early on, and he's saying things that maybe we don't totally understand. As he gets nearer and nearer to the culmination of everything he came to do, that becomes abundantly clear. And so he's talking to his disciples, and he's making it plain to them, like, look, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to have to suffer, and I'm going to have to die. And as you can imagine, the disciples don't take this too well. This idea of suffering is something that we as human beings really don't want anything to do with. And so what happens is Jesus tells the disciples about this, and Peter gets all up in arms, and he says, he rebukes Jesus, and in response, Jesus says, he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." And I think the idea of suffering is something that most of us are not comfortable with. And the thing about suffering is that oftentimes, I think what we do is we let God off the hook too easily. What do I mean by that? Well, I don't mean that God is the source of suffering, of evil, of sin, of anything that causes pain to us in this life. The Bible makes that abundantly clear. But suffering, when it happens, it is never outside of God's will, in the sense that suffering is part of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And we see that happening here. We see that Jesus going to Jerusalem to suffer and to die is actually part of God's mission. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't just some lamentable byproduct of living in a fallen world, although it is something that we can grieve. But suffering is also part of God's plan to rescue us. And in this world right now, we're going through the coronavirus, all this stuff. There's suffering that's happening, and in so many ways that some that we see, some that we don't see, because most of the time we think of suffering as being, a huge, horrible disease or a plague or something like that, and it can be that. But honestly, it can come in so many small ways too that we are experiencing in our day-to-day lives. Just yesterday, I was talking to someone who wanted to speak with me. They just happened to show up at the church here yesterday. I live next to the church, and I thought that they wanted to talk about some big, huge thing that they were going through in their life, and come to find out they'd been in self-quarantine for a couple of weeks, and they were just lonely, and they were scared. And a lot of us are experiencing suffering like that right now, and we are lonely, and we are scared. And human beings, as we've come to find out, like God says, is that we were, it is not good for us to be alone. We were made for community. We were made for connection with other people. And so the suffering we're experiencing right now is very real. It's very real, and we don't have to belittle that and say, well, at least I don't have the plague or something. It's okay to say that suffering can take place in our own lives and in other ways too. And I think the way that it would be helpful for us to reframe this suffering is that it is not outside of God's plan, and it never is. God is fully aware. He is just as present with us in the suffering as he is during seasons of blessing, and God actually has a purpose in suffering. And I think clinging to that and knowing that God is actually at work in the midst of the suffering, we don't have to avoid it. Actually, the way of the cross is the way of the disciple too. There is cross carrying involved in all of this, but we can take comfort in knowing that Jesus is there in the midst of the suffering that he has suffered already for us, on our behalf, and his suffering made available to us a world, an eternity, when there will be no more suffering. And so these pains and the loneliness that we experience today, and the pain and all of that, it reminds us, and it creates in us a longing for a world where there will be no social distancing, for a world where there will be no sickness, no disease, no suffering of any kind at all ever again. And as believers, we have access to that. So God is with you. Whatever you are going through today, what other sufferings are on your heart or are on your mind, Jesus is there with you in the midst of them. They are not outside of his will. He is fully present with you in the pain, and he loves you. And so I pray that that would give you some peace and give you some comfort in knowing that your sufferings are not in vain. God has purpose in them, and he is with you. Blessings on your day and on the rest of your week.